My last two videos explored ambiguous grief and anticipatory grief. Watch to the end where I'll link you to those videos if you wish to explore more. But today we're going to be focusing on complicated grief. I'm Jo McRogers. Welcome to Grief Support That Works. This is our little piece of the YouTube world where we are dedicated to doing grief differently. Complicated grief is often misunderstood. Many believe that complicated grief is defined by how complicated the loss was. Did someone you love go missing? Was there never a body that was found? Were there never charges laid? Was their death a mystery? Did you have a complicated relationship with that person? While all of these factors and more will definitely have impact and influences on your grief, complicated grief actually refers more to the relationship that you have with your own grief than the relationship that you had with the person who has died. So let's look first at some of the research. Complicated grief is a condition that occurs in about 7 to 10% of bereaved people. It is defined as a syndrome in which healing is impeded and acute grief is intense and prolonged. And I would add that intense grief grows exponentially. So next, let's look at some terms also. To be bereaved refers to the experience of having lost somebody that you cared about. Grief is then the psychobiological response to bereavement, which brings around a blend of yearning and sadness along with thoughts, memories, and images of the person who has died. Grief itself is permanent. However, this all-acute, all-consuming, greedy, intense experience of grief usually moderates over time. If it is attended to, the grief becomes less intrusive, less devastating, and becomes integrated into our lives. We accomplish this integration through mourning. Mourning is the expression, the articulation, or the being with our grief. We come to terms with the reality of our loss, and then we are usually able to reorient ourselves to a world without our loved one in it. We are slowly able to reimagine a future with even just glimpses of the light, of the possibility of joy, of love, and satisfaction in our lives. While intensely painful and dominant, the predominant grief becomes integrated, muted, and in the background of our heads, hearts, and minds, even if it's just by nuances and in subtleties through our mourning. Complicated grief is what happens when that transformation does not occur. It can be helpful sometimes to use a medical model to begin to understand this. So, think of your bereavement as a wound. Your grief is the need for cleansing the wound, of having stitches, and then having aftercare and follow-up. You may always have a small scar, but the wound does close over. If the wound is sutured without cleansing, then an infection is likely to develop, and you may require treatment that is not even targeted to the site of the wound. Your body launches an inflammatory response to the infection, and you are caught in a cycle of patterns and responses that remain acute. The result then is delayed healing and increased pain. Complicated grief occurs because aspects of a person's response to the death derail the mourning process. It interferes with learning and with hope. Complicated grief prevents the natural mourning process from occurring. Regular or normal grief and mourning are productive. They bring a process, they bring relief. Complicated grief is a roadblock. Let me know if that makes sense to you in the comments below, because it makes total sense in my head, but that doesn't mean that it will always translate well. Complicated grief is a very personal stall-out. It creates fixed beliefs. Beliefs such as, this is all my fault, people are always leaving me, I don't deserve happiness, I will never be happy again. Because grief exists for everyone, there is a pressure to just sort of suck it up and move on. But for those 7 to 10% of the bereaved, it never leaves that acute psychobiological phase. Those experiencing grief often speak of intense sorrow and pain, rumination over the loss of our loved one, focus being on little else but of the loved one's death. An extreme focus on the reminders of the loved one, or excessive avoidance of reminders. Intense and persistent longing or pining for the deceased. We can have problems accepting the death. We speak about numbness or detachment from our feelings. We experience ruminating and intrusive thoughts or flashbacks. Behaviors that avoid reminders of the deceased, and behaviors that promote reminders of the person we've loved and lost. We can ask if life is worth living. We can blame ourselves for the loss or the ability to prevent the loss. We can feel numb and disconnected. We have difficulty trusting others. We may be unable to perform activities of daily living such as showering, eating, leaving the house. We can have difficulty making decisions. We have impaired focus and memory. We may wish that we had died with or instead of the person that we love who passed. Normal grief brings about all of these beliefs and behaviors, and they are core to those acute days of early grief. But normal grief also eventually includes the invitation to change. It reveals some, and I use this word with great caution, it reveals some hope. At some point, it holds the trust that I may not always feel the way that I do right now. Where complicated grief shows up is that these filters, these experiences become fixed, deep, debilitating feelings, and then they become behaviors. They actually intensify as time passes, 6 months, 8 months, or a year when we're speaking about complicated grief. Unattended, these reactions become normalized thoughts and behaviors as baseline. They then become limiting to one's life. I haven't included a timeline, as a timeline is so personal, but this is normal grief. And this is complicated grief. Research that compared regular grief symptoms experienced after 6 months and then 14 months identified 7 primary symptoms out of 30 that they studied that compose complicated grief. And these 7 distinctive symptoms of complicated grief include intrusive memories or fantasies about the deceased loved one, strong pangs of emotion related to the lost relationship, powerful yearnings or wishes that the departed person was still present, intense feelings or loneliness or emptiness, avoidance of people, places, or activities that remind the grief sufferer of the deceased, recurrent sleep interference and disturbance, significant loss of interest in work, social, personal, or recreational activities. Years later, when this study was reviewed, it has now been identified that 6 months is now considered too soon to assess, and 14 months is considered too long to wait for the identification. Clearly, it's important to not judge anyone's grief too soon, and yet early identification is helpful, as that may make for a shorter time span of being held in these acute grief behaviors and patterns. Knowing how commonly grief is hidden, misdiagnosed, and undersupported, the risk of developing complicated grief is staggering. 2 things that I want to know: how many of you feel that you have experienced complicated grief? And how many of you feel that your complicated grief has been unrecognized? Please leave a comment below so we can identify how common this is. Treatment for complicated grief is designed to help the sufferers find integration and acceptance of how to live fully with this loss in their life. Therapists, peer support groups, physicians, and online communities can all help sufferers to learn to manage their feelings and move on and into their lives. It is a process of continuing to honor their own lives and their departed loved ones rather than being frozen in the acute stage of grief. I'm certain that I have experienced complicated grief several times in my life, Please seek support. I didn't, and I lost many months and years to complicated grief. So please pull back what you can control and seek support for your complicated grief. And I send you kind thoughts, kind words, and a kind heart on your search for support. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.